So if I can ask you guys to stand up. We're going to leave the food for now. Stand up. Thank you. Can you just close your eyes for a minute? Okay. So I think we probably all had a really long day at work, and it takes a while to just, be grounded where we are. So I'll just ask you to take one deep breath. 1, 2, 3. And breathe out. 1, 2, 3. And if you can repeat that for 3 more breaths. Perfect. Enjoy the moment of stillness. So if you can just open your eyes slowly. Now, for your own awareness, just look around the room. Take a look if there's people you know, if there's people you don't know, if there's people you'd like to know. Okay? So part of what we're going to do tonight is that we are going to talk about what really makes us engaged in life. Okay? So part of it requires us a little bit of sense of awareness, and also an awareness not only of ourselves, but of others around in the room. So that's why we start with this exercise. So I'm just going to quickly ask, do people, so I'm going to just explain this really quickly because Martha's really good at this. We once talked about this introvert-extrovert thing, and I thought I misunderstood it. But so I'll just explain. If you're an introvert, usually you're the kind of person that when you're with someone or with your group of people, you really enjoy their company. You can be very social, you can be very shy, you can be one or the other. But when you get home, you need time for yourself. You need to unwind, you need a minute. So you enjoy people's company, but it kind of drains you a little bit. Not because they're draining, it's not what I'm saying, but because it just, you're the kind of person that need to recharge after a social event. So if you identify as someone as an introvert, like I just explained, stay standing. Everybody else, please sit down. I'm not pointing you out or anything, I'm just saying. Okay, so the people that are left standing here, okay, if they walk out a little bit early, if they don't stay up till the end of the night, it's not because it was a bad event, and it was not because the conversation was bad. It was simply because they got drained after a long, long day with people, okay? So be a little bit kinder for them, and don't take it the wrong way if they walk out first, okay? So you guys can sit down. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, so the name of the talk is What Insta Won't Teach You About Life, Hope, and Happiness. And the way this talk came to be is actually quite interesting. But I'll tell you a little bit of what to expect, okay? So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is what's really happening, or what are kind of things or issues that we as young adults, Christian young adults, are really thinking about. And I think it's a very important question to ask, because oftentimes, we have an opportunity, like this is actually a privilege for me to have your attention, It's not to be taken for granted to be able to have people's attention for a specific amount of time. So when I was told to do this talk, I had to kind of go out and ask a couple, maybe 23 or 24 random young adults from the church via text, what would you do if you had an hour or so with young adults? So we're going to explore what's on the mind of young adults like yourself in the church, or who are new to the church but are still curious. We're going to talk about what positive psychology research has revealed regarding what contributes to a healthy and happy life. So when it comes to positive psychology, I'll do a little bit of a definition so you understand really what it is and what it really entails, and we can kind of dive into what the research shows. And then we're going to talk about the importance of authentic connections. So I'm not just saying any connections or any conversations or any social gatherings, but like what would make it something that would change your day, change your life, change your sense of belonging, right? And then the last thing, we're going to look at these concepts from the perspective of Christian spirituality. Okay, because I think we forget that there's so much embedded in the church tradition and practices that already feeds into having a good life. But we don't always see it as such, because I think there's people come from different perspectives. Some people were born into the Christian faith. Some people come to the Christian faith seeking to know more. So it depends on what your perspective you're bringing, but it's important to kind of tie them together. And so, and how does this also tie in with our understanding of hope? Okay, so the story of how this night came to be. So basically, I was asked, ironically enough, this talk was originally supposed to be presented in September. So it actually started last July. So this is so overdue. But it was supposed to be in the IGF event, and I got horribly sick. So Abuna John from downtown came and saved the day, God bless his soul. And he made everybody else look good. And he can, Maurice can attest to that. So basically what happened is that there was a question that I sent to everybody to ask them, you know, if you had this amount of time in the church to talk to young adults like yourself, what topic would you choose for them? Now, ideally, I would go over people's responses and you guys can hear what was said and all that stuff. And that would be like the easier route, right? But I'm not going to really do that right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to take a minute and think about that question. And take a minute and figure out, if you really thought about your own needs as a young adult in the church, what kind of things do you really want to hear? Okay? So, if I can just ask you to take a minute and think about that, and then when you're ready, and only when you're ready, get up, find someone you haven't talked to, you haven't met before, introduce yourself nicely, and then ask them what their perspective is. And try to find 3 people and get 3 different perspectives. And what we're going to do after is that we're going to I want you to tell me what perspectives you heard, not said, but you heard, that really stuck out as something you can relate to and you really think it's worthwhile for us to talk about. Okay? You guys can start now. Who's going to break the ice and get up? If you guys can stand. So this would have been a lot easier without the tables for this reason. Because now it feels like there's actual physical barriers. So what I would recommend, if everybody can come around and just come in this circle here, then there's no barriers and we can just chat for a minute. So if I can have everybody just come in the center circle. Martha's always ready. So if I can have everybody just come in the center circle and awkwardly stare at strangers and say hi to them and then ask them. Okay? So you'll have, I will try to time you, but I'm not restricting you. So I'll let you know in a few minutes when you need to switch. Talk to someone you know and get their perspective. I have to hear your perspective. Okay, if you guys can switch soon. Yes. Okay, are you guys enjoying the awkwardness? Because I've been told this is awkward. People don't hold back. They're very open with me. So I'm sorry for the awkwardness. Just if you can switch one more time, if there's someone you haven't talked to, you'd like to get their perspective, please do now. Okay, if I can ask you guys to get back to your seat. Thank you so much for putting up with the awkwardness so well.
trouble already. I'm not in trouble. You should.
All right, okay, good. Okay, so hopefully you guys got some interesting perspective in terms of, the things that you've heard. Did anyone hear something that they think they'd like to share from someone else about like what we really need as young adults to really like talk about, to hear about? No one heard anything interesting? Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Martha. Yes.
Derive their identities from.
Identity. Yeah. Awesome. So what Martha was saying, where do young people derive their identity from? That's a really, really good question. Does anyone have anything to add to that, or does that question, can anyone relate to this actually? Yes. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so is it more like how to find your self-worth through Christ, and feel more established and grounded in your identity? Okay, awesome. So that's another way to look at it. Okay, that's actually really good. I feel like you guys are reading my mind. Okay, anyways, anyone else? John? I liked yours. Can you share? Okay, so this is what John said and he forgot. So John was saying, we'd love to hear a little bit more about practical Christianity, like Christianity in the workplace, like contemporary Christianity, right? Because I think we, as a church, we're very traditional, and we talk often and we share often narratives of the story of the saints, narratives of the monks, and narratives of persecution, martyrdom, a lot of other things that are in our church that are actually, some of them are still contemporary, which is quite tragic, but also maybe not as relevant to our Canadian Coptic identity as they are to our global identity as Copts, right? So how do we have conversations about how to be Christians today, now, within the workplace, within our normal environments, and not necessarily with other Christians, but in the world, with life, in the grocery store, when someone is butting you, Anyone else? Yes, Maurice? Okay, the great unknown, go ahead. Do you want the mic? I feel like you like mics. You would actually take my mic.
I do like mics. I'm keeping this. I'm just going to stay here. The one about the great unknown in terms of where are we going, because it feels like young adults are in this weird phase where they're kind of supposed to know what they're doing, but they're kind of guessing what they're doing and not entirely sure about what they actually should be doing in life. Like they're kind of faking being an adult at this point, right? Thinking that you have everything worked out, when in reality you're kind of just figuring out as you go. Exactly. So essentially just trying to figure that part out of your personality, I think. I may have butchered that one.
It's okay. Okay, I'll try to put it in more. I'll try to put it in words that convey your meaning. Does that help you at all? Okay, I hope so too. Okay, so I think what Maurice is getting at is this. It seems like you wake up one day, you're done with school, you're done with university, you have a job, you get paid, you go home, and you're supposed to be this like person who's like full grown. And inside you don't feel that way. People keep talking to you about these major decisions, and you're looking at them weird, like, I'm sorry, what? Like, I'm not ready for this. But you're looking like you're ready. You look like you got everything figured out, but internal struggle. There's an internal struggle of like, what does it am I ever going to feel full grown? Am I ever going to feel like I'm ready to face the world? Because I look like I am, but I don't feel like I am. Does that summarize? Okay, cool. All right. Can anyone relate to that? I'm getting nods because people won't raise their hands in this. This one is a big one. I get nods instead. Okay, cool. Anything else that came out that you guys think is worth sharing? So I'm hearing identity, right? I'm hearing like application, like how do I apply my values in real life, right? I'm hearing about the continual struggle of knowing yourself. Because I think being an adult has to do with knowing yourself and knowing what you're capable of and owning up to it and being accountable for it and all these things as well. So it's a little bit of that. So that's really, really good. So thanks, guys, for sharing that. So what ended up happening, this is kind of like the rough draft of what happened after, God knows, 23 texts to random people and trying to get themes out of it. And this is what came out. And this is based on the actual responses from young adults like you. So I did a word cloud, and what you can see is these are the topics that came out. God is always a big one. Feeling there's one way to certain things. There was issues with concerns about culture, traditions, concerns about how to live your life, how to spend your time. There was people who were talking about, we need to hear more about attachment theory. How do we build relationships? How do we build authentic connections? Life phase. That was one of them that came out. How do I deal with this life phase? How do I move from one phase to the next? How do I, move forward? There was a lot of comments about things that are unsaid in Christian communities. Fears that are not always talked about openly, or doubt about maybe. It could be doubt about faith, doubt about how to live your life, doubt about what we're taught, right? There were so many different things that came out. I'll just read a few. There was perfectionism. I think that came out, and that one was interesting because when you are raised with such high caliber of values, and I think Christianity is a beautiful place to learn about virtue and values, and there's so many stories, and we said the narratives of the saints and the sacrifice and the selflessness, and then you compare to that, and how do you deal with the fact that you don't measure up, right? So these are some things that people said. Comparison was a big one. Coping skills. How do you cope with anxiety? How do you cope with stress? How do you cope with knowing that you sometimes don't measure up? And is that really true, or you just feel that way, right? Yeah, it was really interesting, actually. I can read this whole thing. Wanting to have deeper understanding, dealing with guilt, dealing with shame, confidence, being able to explore, the black and white thinking. I love that one. When that one came out, it was like, how do we deal with mental traps? How do we deal with seeing things in black and white where there's vagueness? Because just like the church doesn't have laws, the church has mysteries. So there are things in life that will mystify you, right? You're not going to always know. It's not going to always be black and white, and that's why we pray, and that's why we ask God for guidance, right? But there was just so much that came out of those responses that I thought was really interesting. So here are the major themes. I kind of narrowed down the nonsense into maybe like 6 themes. And guess what was the first one? Identity. Identity is a major one for this group. We're struggling. We're struggling with identity because there are those who were raised in Egypt, those that are raised here. The Coptic Orthodox faith is essentially the same, but the crossover, I think, from the culture into our tradition is just making it hard. It's making it hard to figure out if we belong. It's making it hard to figure out what really is our identity. So there's questions of identity. There's questions about time. How do you spend your time? The value of time. How am I supposed to spend my time on this earth? Right? Someone give me a manual. I want instructions because it's too hard to decide. And I think that was one of the things that came up. There was also, I talked about mental traps or thinking traps. How do I, don't fall into thinking certain things about a group of people, about my own limitations, my own abilities, right? So this was something that came up as well. Also, I have to mention, so thinking traps can be identified as different things. It can also, they're what makes us either optimistic or a little bit pessimistic, right? So if I see the world in a certain light, that can dictate what opportunities I see. If I narrow my scope or if I widen it, right? So thinking traps were the big thing. Spirituality, we were talking about identity in Christ, right? That's one of those things that encompasses a lot of other things, because if you see your life through the lens of spirituality, if you see all these things through the lens of spirituality, then it changes what you see, right? We have stereotypes. The damage of stereotypes. Who here is a pharmacist? Raise your hands. Best stereotype ever in the Coptic community. All pharmacists do this, all pharmacists don't do this, all cops are pharmacists. All of them end up in the same whatever. You tell someone is a pharmacist, the conversation ends. They have no interest in knowing the rest. It's like, I don't know, man. It just turns people away. So stereotypes, how to get over them. Resilience, how do I learn the skills to get up when I fall? And I fall a lot. And the irony of it is I'm supposed to fall. But somehow, some of us think that, let's say we fall into sin. We're talking about sin. I mean, we fall into a lot of different things in life, but let's say we're talking about sin. Some people assume that, you fall into sin, you go to confession, and Abuna's with us, so Abuna knows, how amazing confession can be and how healing it can be. But you leave confession and you still carry the guilt, like it's a badge of honor. Why? Do I believe that God is forgiving or not, right? And it's a matter, and I actually truly believe that for us, it's not a matter of, when I say why and do I believe or do I not believe, it sounds like I'm guilting you into I'm actually making you feel worse, right? Because I'm like, you should believe. But actually that's not the case. The way our mind works, it's not that easy to let go of things, right? So how do I learn the skills to be compassionate to myself? To have self-compassion and to get up after I fall and after I sin and then see life in a new light and accept God's forgiveness, right? So resilience is a huge topic that came out as well. I need to learn to cope. How do I do that? Authentic connection was by far one of the best ones, I think, because I think that's one of the things that we kind of all want in life, authentic connections. So that was one of those things that came up as how do we build authentic connections? How do we have deeper understanding of other people? How do we have patience and forgiveness? And how do we build relationships that don't fall apart when someone disappoints you? And why is it that we go into a relationship assuming that someone disappoints us and when they do, we just walk away? Why can't we just stick with it? Why are we assuming perfectionism on our end and on their end, right? So it was really interesting. So I'm going to just mention the study because this is a really cool study. And it was done by the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And it was done in 1938, I believe, right after the Great Depression. And the study was done by a team of psychologists who wanted to know, they wanted to study life and what makes life what makes for a happy life? What makes for a life that someone at the end of the day would say, I lived and I lived it well? Okay? So this study was started in 1938. It's actually still running. It's an 80-plus year study. It had 4 different directors, research directors. So they gone and they started the study. They went. They passed. They started with 30-something male sophomores, and then a couple years later, they recruited their wives, who were like, about time, please. And then after that, they recruited their children, who are now in their 50s and 60s. So they looked at their lives. And they realized there's something very, very clear here about the pattern that they're seeing. And these are some of the patterns that they saw, okay? So the first thing that they noticed is that loneliness can happen within and without a relationship, okay? So loneliness has nothing to do with whether you're in a relationship or not, which really brings us to the idea of thinking, well, or actually it breaks down the myth that if you get into a relationship, you're not going to feel lonely anymore, right? Sometimes people feel lonely and they get into relationships and they assume that's going to solve it. But you have to ask yourself, if you're lonely, like, loneliness is not the same thing as being alone, right? There are people that get into relationships, they don't feel authentic connection. And they can actually feel lonelier. So they looked at all these different people in the relationship and they said, okay, one thing is loneliness. It's irrelevant of whether you're in a relationship or not. There are people who are not in a relationship who have such a good network of friends, family, good support network, good authentic friendships, that they don't struggle with loneliness. And there are people that were married that were struggling with loneliness, severe loneliness, okay? And the second thing they found is what? Unresolved, like loneliness that's not addressed, is the same as, has the same death rate as alcoholism and smoking, which is pretty bad. All the pharmacists here know. Ask a pharmacist. Find a pharmacist, ask the pharmacist. You'll see a new side to them. So it's if you think about it, it's pretty bad. So, which brings us to, of course, if you guys attended the beginning of the series, the first talk was Christina? Yep. Therapy and stigma. So I was talking about how sometimes people need to go to therapy just to understand themselves and to sort these things out, regardless of, they don't have to have problems, but they need to have sounding board, right? So if people are struggling with loneliness and they can't figure it out on their own and they can't seem to get out of it, it's a great place to start, right? Either with your spiritual father who can kind of guide you through it, or if it actually becomes, if it develops into something more isolating, then please approach a counselor, approach a therapist, or talk to a really good friend who can help you figure out what to do next. So what else did they find? Okay, so I'm a big fan of this whole quantity over quality thing, you know? And I think my friends are actually quite aggravated by it because, like, you know, like if I hang out with them, it's not short, we have to get into deep, meaningful conversation. They literally get aggravated and they're like, can't we have like a light conversation where we're not talking about anything? And I love like everybody in the room who knows me is like nodding. They're like, oh God, yes. So quality over quantity, right? What is the quality? So it refers to two things. It refers to the quality of your relationships, but also refers to the quality of how you spend time in those relationships, right? So we've all, I think if you grew up in the church environment when you're very young, and then there's like convention, and then there's conferences, and then there's like a soccer team, and then there's a basketball team, you're always with people, and it's great. And if you're in that kind of environment, and you're lonely, you have to ask yourself what kind of interactions you're having or connections. What's the level of quality? How deep are you getting in those connections? And what's holding you back from having real conversations? And I'll go a little bit into like what entails real conversations and real connection, but it's something to get you thinking about it, okay? So for sure, they realize quality is over quantity, okay? And for them, the clearest message was that good relationships keep us happier and healthier, period. Okay? And that was even when they studied people who were like in like bad neighborhoods. So we talk about environment, right? People often say, I'm not happy because this is not working out, I don't have the right job, I don't have this, I don't have that, right? Sometimes it's things that you have, sometimes the environment, sometimes it's legit like you have some, difficult relationships that are like intimate relationships in your life that are causing stress. So there's a lot of things that can happen to a person. But if they realize that there's something very protective of your ability to be happy if you have good relationships, right? So if you're in a difficult environment, let's say at home, but you have good supportive friends who give you their attention when they're with you, they're active listeners, they're people that you can rely on, they're people that would be there when you need them, that tends to lift you up, empower you, right? Even it lifts up your experience of your evaluation of your own life. Okay, so this is what they found. So the happiness formula is basically what they realized about the idea of being happy, right? Or like, so I'm gonna have to define happiness a little bit because I think there's a definition that the church often uses. And I think it's like a casual one. I don't think it's a firm one. Abuna can obviously correct me because it's nice having a priest in the audience because then you don't run with your mouth. Okay, so Abuna, so they always say like happiness is temporal, it comes and goes, it's emotional, right? So I mean, that's what I hear in terms of how the church defines happiness often. I think the positive psychology definition of happiness is more closer to joy. So it's sustained sense of well-being in spite of events, whether they're negative or positive, okay? So you can be in the middle of a struggle, but still, like, it's kind of like, think of the person that you meet who's like, yeah, I'm going through this and this and this, but thank God, like, things are okay, it's gonna pass, and they have a sense of peace about it. That's basically what they are referring to when they talk about happiness in the positive psychology definition, okay? So it's supposed to be, so they've even studied they've actually studied monastic communities, Christian, Buddhist, Catholic nuns, like, it's really interesting the amount of spiritual communities they studied, and they do have a huge section in terms of one of the main sections of positive psychology or discipline is meaning, and a huge part of it comes from spirituality. So it's almost acknowledging and validating a lot of our belief system, a lot of the things that are in our tradition, and I'll get into that later actually. So they said basically happiness is 50% genetics. So this is like, this can like make you or break you as a statement. Happiness is 50% genetics, right? So if you're the person who looks around your family and is like, oh God, this family is so depressing, for example, you're gonna have someone to blame. It's good, laughing is good for you. It means I'm a little bit tired. Okay, so genetics. So if you have a cause of concern, so if you have a family member or family members who tend to get anxious, tend to get depressed, you're more likely to fall on that same route, okay? But fear not. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that if you're aware, you can address it. It's in everything in life. Like, there's no such thing as perfect families. Like, dysfunctional families are like sometimes the norm, but we have to know how to work with them, right? No one gets a manual on how to be family members. We just learn to love each other in spite of all, and with all of our flaws. So the genetic piece speaks to why there are things like people who will need medication at some point if they're getting severely depressed, if they're struggling with anxiety and all that stuff. That is legit, that is extremely helpful, but you have to also understand is the environmental conditions is 10%. It's 10%. I think everyone overestimates that. Everybody's always like, oh my God, if I had this, I'll be fine. If it's because of this environment, it's because I'm here, that's why I'm not happy. But actually, It's not. It's 10%. It's barely it. So you're more likely it's because of your genetics or because of your attitude. So you have to ask yourself, even if you have a predisposition for a mood disorder or anxiety or depression or any of that stuff, and you're not feeling well, you're not feeling that you could be at peace or have joy or all that stuff, you have to ask yourself, what kind of attitude am I carrying forward? What kind of life practices am I actually practicing day to day that would help reinforce a good, healthy perspective on life? Am I doing that, or am I actually practicing things that are causing avoidance, that are causing emotional numbing, that are putting me closer to having like bad coping skills, right, with like difficult times? So that's something to definitely think about. So this is something to remember. So before you say it's because someone else or because of this, think twice. Okay? All right, cool. So for most of us, belonging to school, families, it's easy. You don't have to work hard at times, right? We have our groups. We have our friends' wedding we go to. We have our church gatherings. We have the occasional, yoga class. That's just me, but that's just me. Moving on. But then you have like really frustrating moments with friends that you just don't know how to deal with them. You don't know, right? And then you get to a point where okay, am I officially going to call this friend toxic and then cut them off? Or I'm going to just sit through it, talk it out until we hash it out and we're stuck with each other for life, right? So there's something to be said of, you're not going to get a perfect friend, right? And obviously I'm not like the balanced one in this picture, but anyways, in general, it's not going to always work perfectly well, right? So you might fix it with a meal and a conversation, or you might decide to go down a different route. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do right now is that I'm going to go a little bit, so authentic connections is the theme I'm focusing on for now, because there's so many themes that came up, like I said before, identity, time, because I think it's a really good one, and I think it also overlaps really well with that study from Harvard that I mentioned. Okay? So I don't want to run too long, but this should have like a spin-off session on its own, because there's so much, you can go so much deeper on authentic connections that I'm just going to skim the surface. And then maybe if you want to talk about it a little bit after, we can, but we'll see how the time goes. So for authentic connections, I kind of wanted to go over some things that we need to keep in mind when we're building authentic connections, okay? So the first thing, which is the hardest thing, which is know yourself. Who gets really aggravated when they hear that statement? They're like, what are you talking about? Like, who feels like it needs some clarity? Does anyone here feel like that statement needs clarity? You know yourself. You look like you know yourself. Okay. Does anyone struggle with what people mean when they say that? Okay. Yes? Yes? Maybe? You don't have to say yes because I'm asking and people are looking at me blankly. It's okay. You don't have to say it. No pressure. Okay. So here's what I think about the know yourself statement. You cannot know yourself if you're constantly distracted. You cannot know yourself if you don't sit and think about your day. You can't know yourself if you don't pay attention to how you handle stress, if you don't pay attention to how you celebrate joys, if you don't pay attention to how you cope with celebrating other people's joy. Things like comparison, things that can sometimes make you feel high or low depending on how your perspective is, right? So knowing yourself has a lot to do with quiet time, contemplation. It has a lot to do with self-reflection, which is something that requires a bit of stillness. And I think nowadays it might be getting a little bit harder because it's like with our technology and accessibility and having quiet time becomes like, wow, like how do I squeeze in quiet time? So know yourself is one of the major things, because in an authentic connection, if you know yourself, you can express yourself, okay? And you should be able to feel safe to express yourself, okay? So knowing yourself is one thing. The other thing is trust. So what do people think we need to trust other people? Like, what is something legit I need in order to trust someone else? I'm gonna make you guys do an activity. Yes. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So you don't expect follow through. So you don't trust. So what causes you not to trust is when you feel like the projection of what you're seeing is going to end up in a really bad spot. Like you can't, the person doesn't look accountable, the person doesn't look like they're responsible, like behaviors. Yes. Yes, yes. So previous experience. You're talking about the previous experience can dictate whether you trust or not in the future. Yes, appease you. So no follow through. That's how trust is broken. Okay, that makes good sense. So that's how trust is broken. When you ask something of someone and there's no follow through, and then not even is there no follow through, there's lying, that's just different. But how is trust built? What do you guys think you need to have to build trust with someone else? Yes, Daniel. I haven't seen you in ages since like calculus class in university, man. It's like a reunion. Sorry. How are you? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Good. Okay. So, what Daniel said that no one can hear, as I went on a tangent about how I haven't seen him for a while, is that trust requires you to be open and vulnerable. And it's interesting that you. So, I think there's two ways that people answer this question when I ask it. One way is to say, I need this and this and this from the other person. Not often do people say, I need to put in this and this and this to get trust, right? So for you to mention vulnerability is a really good thing because I think we forget that someone's got to start. To build trust, someone is going to do a testing. I remember once talking to a friend who's saying she has problems trusting because she's had a really bad experience in the past. And I said, like, what do you do to get over that? And she's like, I just don't trust people. And I'm like, okay, well, there's another way to go about it. You can do like a litmus test, like one small thing that doesn't really mean much to you, but you're vulnerable about it and you share it with them and you see how they handle it, right? So, I mean, that's exactly it. I think that's really amazing. Like, that's really good what you said. So, vulnerability. You have to trust, you have to start. But you don't necessarily have to start with something big and overly exposing, right? Because sometimes we're fragile from our previous experience. So if we are trying to build trust, we don't need to be like, like we don't need to do overkill, but we need to realize that we have to some extent be open with other people, with who we are. We have to come as you have to come as you are, right? Not like as a different person. So trust requires me to put in, to be vulnerable to some extent. But I get to choose how I'm going to be vulnerable and to what extent. Okay? Great. So shame resilience. So shame resilience, does anyone have an idea of what like that kind of sounds like? Do we need to define shame and guilt? Do people know the difference between the two? Yes? No? Okay. I love this group. A lot of nodding. Okay, so guilt. So guilt is when you do something wrong and you feel bad about it. Shame is when you do something wrong and you feel like something is wrong with you. Like you personalize it. You take it as like an identity thing. Like I am broken, I'm unworthy. That's shame. So shame resilience requires your ability to be able to navigate shame. Okay, so and I don't know if maybe Abuna can jump into this. Abuna, what do you think is a good way to navigate the sense of shame, from like just from your perspective as a priest, from your experience?
Self-identity, self-worth, understanding my worth in God's eyes, and you know, there are many verses that speak about the concept of not just falling in despair and staying down, but rising again, rising from sin, rising from bad habits, understanding our worth in God's eyes, and also, you know, having a deep sense of godly self-worth.
Yeah.
I think it's the confidence doesn't only come from my own confidence in myself, even though this is really important, but in understanding my worth in God's eyes. So I'm no longer just, you know, falling down, sorry, and staying down, but wanting a change, you know, even, you know, feeling a little bit of the guilt is, if it spurs me to repentance or to get back on my feet, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
But just staying down and blaming myself and, you know, feeling that sense of shame is difficult.
Right, exactly. Thank you, Bruna. I think. Okay, so thank you, Bruna. I think, you know what I find really beautiful about, for me as someone who studied positive psychology, is that I used to, I agree with you when you're talking about like the damaging effect of persistent shame. And I remember I used to go to talks and people would say, you know, it's not good for you to stay in the state. It's not good for you to stay in the state. It's not good for you to stay. And I would sit there and be like, okay, that's great, but like, what do I do now? Like, I'm in the state, like, right? So I used to feel really overwhelmed. Is that like, I know I'm not supposed to feel shame, and I know that you know, the sacrament of confession, I'm able to let go of that guilt. But as a human being, I still struggle with it. So I think a great thing that came to me, like came in terms of what I've learned in positive psychology, is that shame resilience requires you to have safe space to share the story of your shame with someone who can provide you with empathy and someone who can provide clarity of where to do justice to that feeling, but also do justice in terms of perspective. Because oftentimes when we share the things that we are ashamed about, we realize, and if we share them in safe, good company that is wise and that is trustworthy, we realize that my experience is not unique to me. This is a human experience, and this is part of being human. Not necessarily shame is part of being human, but whatever is causing shame is part of being human. So am I really going to internalize that as I'm broken or I'm human? And if I accept my humanity and I accept that I was also created in God's image and the potential for me as a human being in Christ, then there's healing, there's shame resilience that builds. So I think confession is a huge, huge step towards building shame resilience. I think therapy is a huge, huge part towards building shame resilience. I think friends who are non-judgmental are a huge, huge advantage and treasure, because that allows us to talk about things that we feel horrible about, maybe in front of the public, but in the intimacy of a good friendship, there's a healing connection that comes to that comes from that. So shame resilience requires us to share and talk about things and not hide and not internalize and not think that we're the only ones. And even if we go through something that's really unique and really painful, it's important to humanize it in the right space. So healthy boundaries. So boundaries have been, I think they've kind of been mentioned back and forth in different churches. I've heard them before. I have no idea who goes to what. But at some point, I feel like, because I am on like, I feel like in social media, depending what you follow, you see so many messages about it, because I'm in mental health. I always hear about the stuff, but I have no idea what everybody else is seeing. So there's always like overestimation that everybody knows what I know. So healthy boundaries has to do with the fact that I feel safe to say no. I feel safe to say yes. I don't feel pressured to go in any direction. I can hold the integrity of my values in a friendship or in a relationship, even if there's disagreement, without falling apart, right? So healthy boundaries means that I'm aware this is where I start and this is where I end, this is where you start and this is where you end. And we're two different people. And the differences are not a reason to panic. The differences have to do with the fact that we hold true to our values and our integrity, right? So healthy boundaries means, in that sense, it allows you to do these things. It allows you to define who you are and be who you are in relationships. How do you set them is a bigger, deeper question, but it basically starts with learning to not compromise who you are when you're trying to build relationships, right? Oftentimes people try to impress to the point of changing who they are. You're already falling into a place you don't want to be. So healthy boundary give you space to say, this is what I am, this is what I am, this is what I am not, and please respect what I am and what I'm not, and don't try to pressure me in any ways. And if you have friendships and people in your life who can respect that definition, those things that you set to define you, those are good friends who can respect your boundaries and your limits. They don't push you to do things you don't want to do. And at the same time, you don't feel guilty where you have to stretch yourself to appease them, okay? So the last thing you really need is, it's called, big compassion. Big compassion, so big is actually, is an acronym for boundary, integrity, and generosity. So meaning that in order to be compassionate, truly compassionate, not for the sake of, I need to look good because I'm a Christian, otherwise I'm gonna look like a jerk and everybody's watching me, but compassion where it's like, I am happy with what I am, with being forgiving. Like I am satisfied with this. I'm going to be compassionate and forgiving with this person, and I'm at peace with it. I'm not pressured. I'm not doing it to look good. So it says boundary, integrity, and generosity, meaning what? I need boundaries to have good relationships. I need to hold my own integrity. I need to know what I stand for and what I don't stand for. And generosity has to do with the assumptions I make. Oftentimes people disappoint us, and we rush to say they're not worth our time. Generous assumptions mean if someone disappoints you, you do the most awkward thing ever. You call them and you say, yo, you know like that thing that we didn't talk about that you did yesterday? Let's talk about it now. I know it's uncomfortable. I know in the middle of the meeting. I know you're this and this and this, but we need to hash this out. So generous assumptions allow you to get into an uncomfortable conversation, assuming the person didn't intend to hurt you, and have that conversation so that you can get to a place of compassion. Oftentimes we just, you know what, he didn't mention it, I didn't mention it, I'm not going to be the one to mention it. And then like 20 years later, we don't know what happened in this friendship. All I know is this one thing happened, I don't remember what it is. What was his name again? And then it's the end of it, right? So authentic connections require an ability to be very generous with your assumption when people disappoint. So that you can, when you extend compassion and forgiveness, it's not for show. It's really, you're not holding a grudge. It's not for later. It's not that you're fine now, we're going to talk about it later, right? So what happens when the connections are not so authentic? You have perfectionism. So someone mentioned that earlier, I think. Someone mentioned that earlier. So perfectionism happens when there's a fear of being judged. So you're constantly afraid of people judging you, and you're constantly afraid of seeming that you don't know what you're doing, so you lean towards perfectionism. not realistic, and it's very anxiety provoking. So if you are feeling that you're leaning towards that, you have to ask yourself, are these relationships really founded on something real, or is this for show? We just have to look like I always have to look like I have everything together, and I'm in my mind I might be comparing myself with that person. In my mind I might be feeling pressured to seem like everything is perfect because they're also perfect, or they seem perfect. So perfectionism is what happens sometimes when the connection is not authentic and you're not really comfortable in the relationship. Guilt is one thing I've mentioned earlier. You do things out of, you don't want to make them feel like, you don't want them to be upset with you. Like half the friendship is like, I don't want to upset him. I don't want to upset her. And then in the end, it's like, I spend most of my time just making sure they're not upset. I don't even know what I'm getting in this friendship. Like, I don't even know what's happening, right? That's a lot of pressure. You can't carry that with you. Comparison, like I mentioned earlier. Empathy misses. I love those. So empathy misses can, I don't know if anyone would know an example of an empathy miss, but like, you guys might know a good example. Okay, so an empathy miss is like, someone walks in, and they're like, hey, you won't believe what happened today. I got this and this at work. I'm so excited. We need to celebrate. He's like, oh, really? Oh, man, that's nothing. I got this and this happening at work. Oh, my God, my thing is so much like, oh, you should see what happened. All of a sudden, this person is talking about their own life, and your moment is completely gone, and they have not even taken in what you said, and they have not even shared your joy, and you feel completely dismissed. So empathy misses happens when the interactions that we're having are, like the person you share things with them and they're not actively listening. They're not actively aware of the emotion behind it. That you're actually sharing a moment of joy and they don't acknowledge what you're saying, right? So empathy misses happens when the connection is not really that strong, and it might be a little bit superficial. People pleasing. I kind of mentioned this earlier. It has to do with, again, feeling guilty. You're pressured to please people because you always feel bad. If you're feeling like that, which I actually do think this is probably quite common in the Christian community. We're called to be selfless, that's true. We're called to be kind and generous, that's true. But we're not called to do it and do it while being anxious, while feeling that we don't have time for ourselves. We don't have, we feel like we carry this shame ongoing. Like that kind of needs to stop. So people pleasing is not helping anyone. Often the time, the people that you try to please, you can't always please them because they're the first one to use guilt to get you to do more people pleasing. It's like this vicious cycle, right? Like if you're ever, and I think I'm not the only one who probably has seen this. Sometimes it happens in circles and with servants. We all love to be there for our community. We all love to serve, but when we say, no, I can't do this, and you set boundaries, I really can't, I have the job, I have this, and someone says, La عشان خاطر مش عارفة مين Mary Gerges, and like St. Mary, and then you're like, oh my God, St. Mary's going to get disappointed in me. When you get into that cycle, you give, and the cycle repeats. The leader who's leading the service will do this again. And it's not malicious. Like, they're not doing to torment you. They probably don't even know this stuff, right? Like, they just think, like, this is how they were all raised. Like, it's like, we just take care of each other. And then as you get older, you put pressure on the young ones. And the young ones, like, it's a nice cycle that we've kept going for years. But it'd be so much nicer if we can say, hey, like, no, I really can't. But I know someone who can. Give me 2 days. I'll give you a call with a volunteer. That solves the problem. You stay true to your integrity, to your needs, but you've also done the good Christian thing of being thoughtful, of trying to solve this problem. And it doesn't mean that you're going to guilty your friend in 2 days and give a new number. That would be just cruel and mean and just inconsiderate, guys, so don't do that. Okay? Cool. All All right. Oh my God. You guys have been so quiet for so long. I can't wait to do this. Okay. So we're going to actually do an activity, and you require all of you to stand up, and all of you come in the middle, and I'll explain it as you come here because you guys are slow and you look like you're always dragging your feet. So let's go. Not yet. I just want them to look. It's going to take forever. I don't think they're coming either. I know. All right. We're waiting for the group in the back. The group in the back. I'm not pointing fingers, but we're waiting for the group in the back.